And I know that I think only about 75% of you were able to access the poll. So it looks like we have a pretty strong representation of where people are looking to travel this summer. Kelsey, I don't know if you're going to flip to the first slide, please. Today we acknowledge I am currently located on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Silks people in the Okanagan Valley, which has been stewarded by them since time immemorial. Why don't we each take a moment and acknowledge the land that we are currently on and give gratitude for those that have looked after it for time immemorial. Thank you. So today we're talking about affordable housing. We're talking about affordability and livability and the work that we have spent so much time and energy on, all directly due to our need for our workforce, our employees, and ensuring that they have somewhere to live. Our key players currently are, as you can see from our slide here, we have about 7 million Airbnb active listings in British Columbia and about 2 million on VRBO. Of course, these are only two of many online distribution channels for short-term rentals. I'm joined, Kelsey, let me just introduce Kafia and David first. I think that we had a slide with the two of them that I can introduce them as speakers. So I'm joined today with two distinguished guests. I'm honored they're making themselves available to contribute today to our presentation. Kafia Youssef, Manager Policy Stakeholder Relations, the Hotel Association of Canada, and Professor David Washmuth, Canadian Research Chair in Urban Governance from McGill University. Thank you both for joining us. So when we think about why are we here today, and we can go back to the financialization of housing, Kelsey, please. It really is the reason that has brought us all together. When we look at the affordability and the impact of the changing housing market, this is happening in jurisdictions all over the world. And when we look at our responses from you, our members, but also our industry and other industries within British Columbia and across Canada, increasingly the financialization of housing is erasing long-term housing supply. And the direct impact of that is when we have that reduction of long-term housing, then all of a sudden housing costs go up. And that's not only the cost to purchase a house, but more importantly for us is the long-term rental housing prices as well, as there is a reduction in availability and therefore the cost goes up, supply and demand. Thank you, Kelsey. So the harmful and common trend is not only the short-term rental housing that is one at a time, but it is the commercialization of affordable rental housing. And that means entire apartments or apartment buildings or whole homes that were built in residential neighborhood are taken out of that housing supply and the rental supply, and they bypass the standard regulations and taxes imposed on hotels and bed and breakfasts. Our position is an even playing field is fair for all, and that housing within apartment buildings that were purpose-built or homes for rental or ownership should remain so. The workforce crisis. So this is the frame around the intention and the work and the research that's been done. Prior to the pandemic, we had about 25,000 people within our hotel-specific workforce that were left unfilled. We currently have filled that since the pandemic, and we have about 20,000 left for the hotel sector in British Columbia. But when we look at the dire shortage, so 82,000 positions within British Columbia in industries greater than the hotel sector, when we're looking at tourism and businesses and small businesses and wineries and all of the other things that make up our ecosystem, this workforce crisis is completely strangled by the lack of affordable rental housing for full-time year-round workers as well as seasonal workers. So all of the efforts and investment in solving the workforce crisis are actually limited in success by the housing shortage and the affordability of housing. Kafia and David, thank you so much for joining us. Really pleased. Kafia, I believe over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ingrid. I am very excited to join you all today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kafia Youssef. I'm the Manager of Policy and Stakeholder Relations at the Hotel Association of Canada. And today, I'll be covering first some history on where we've come nationally in regulating short-term rentals, the shifting perspective on the impact of short-term rentals, and I'll also be closing with some proven best practices here in Canada and internationally. And so very excited to share this information with you today. So moving on to the first slide, just a little history. HAC has been working on this file for over 4 years. We've seen significant progress in over 50 jurisdictions across Canada. And to understand how that's achieved, moving to the next slide, we'll start to see more of the evolution of these restrictions and what occurred when short-term rentals first entered the scene. So at first, a lot of the concern was simply registration and making sure that hosts were formally registered. And quickly, there was a realization that registration would simply not be enough to curb the commercial growth of short-term rentals. And of course, this is like whack-a-mole. When you solve one issue, another issue arises. And here we have the issue of making sure there is a platform accountability. So once principal residence came into play, we wanted to make sure that platforms were responsible for going through and removing illegal hosts, as well as the obligation to share compliance data to make sure that municipalities could do their best in regulating the short-term rental hosts themselves, as well as hefty prohibitive fines for the platforms that did not comply. And then as you see on this map here, provinces started to get involved with provincial registries, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and most recently, Quebec's legislation that includes, for the first time in Canada, principal residence across the province, as well as platform accountability measures. And so this is all really, really important progress that's been made. And moving to the next slide. So what's led to this change? And I think it's important to look at this in two lenses, so pre and post. So pre-pandemic, when short-term rentals came to the scene, they were seen as innovative disruptors and a lot of public favor in their model. However, years later, especially post-pandemic, a lot of communities started to grapple with the effects of short-term rentals, the social costs, and realizing that a dedicated STR would take a long-term rental unit out of the market and encourage financialization of housing that Ingrid had touched upon earlier. And so now you'll see a shift in public opinion. A lot of scroll on TikTok, Twitter, a lot of Gen Z millennials are concerned about the impact of short-term rentals in their neighborhoods and the impact on the cost of housing. So if you go to the next slide, we'll also see a shift in municipalities' goals when regulating short-term rentals. So at first, a level playing field was really important. So fair taxation for short-term rental platforms and bringing them in line with other accommodation providers. as well as community safety. So I'm sure you've read articles of the party houses and the violence that has occurred. So that was an increasing concern at one point. But now what superseded all of them is the need to protect long-term housing with the ongoing housing crisis across many different cities in Canada. And another concern that Ingrid had touched upon too was industry. So a lot of industries especially hotels, a lot of our workers are finding it difficult to access housing, affordable housing. And this is why hotels across Canada are building and creating more affordable staff accommodations so that their staff have access to affordable housing options close by. And so here, I'd also like to talk about some of the federal success that has been realized in the legislation of short-term rentals. So federally, we've achieved fair tax. A lot of short-term rental platforms are now required to remit GST and HST to government. There's also a digital services tax that will be brought into force in the next few years that will be at 3%, following the model that other countries internationally have, like France. And municipalities like Toronto and Ottawa have implemented what we like to call gold standard regulations. And I'll go into detail on that in the next slide here. So when I say gold standard, what do I mean? I mean that both Toronto and Ottawa have mandatory principal residence requirements. They both have strong platform accountability measures. Specifically, Ottawa has the requirement that short-term rental companies have a physical address in Canada in order to be fully registered with the city. And a report that just recently was released just a few days ago shows that there's some early success. The successful enforcement due to the platform accountability measures has led to 800 units that were formerly short-term rentals being converted back into the long-term rental market. So it's really important for housing to get as many units as possible in that long-term rental housing stock. So that's great news for success. And internationally, we're also seeing some really strong regulations. So in Paris, they have really strong regulations that require display on the sites, as well as throughout Croatia. We're hearing Florence as well. They've just introduced some regulation to ban all new short-term rentals, and they're also providing tax incentives for existing short-term rentals to be converted to long-term rentals. So the housing crisis is really important throughout the world, and just our neighbor, New York, recently in America just released their own new rules that limit short-term rentals to principal residence. And a lot of housing advocates are speculating that this could lead to a significant amount of units coming back into the long-term rental housing stock over there. So that's a jurisdiction to watch for sure. And so just looking at what are the best practices in all of these gold standard case, you see principal residence. Principal residence is really important to curb the growth of commercial short-term rentals. And with principal residence comes an inclusion of platform accountability measures to make sure that successful enforcement can be implemented. This really shifts the responsibility for enforcement directly into the hands of platforms, where they're required to remove all illegal listings to make sure that their hosts are compliant with municipal rules and provincial rules. And then we also have mandatory data sharing. So this allows municipalities to have real-time live access to on-the-ground data on who's legal, who's illegal, and it really helps with compliance. And so to conclude, last slide here, we're in a special moment right now. There's a lot of increasing pressure across different municipalities to regulate short-term rentals. And so I'll just go to the last slide here. You can see my details here, and you can get in contact with me. I think the number one thing here is really to reach out to your communities and see what you can do, what's happening on the ground in your community when it comes to housing, and when it comes to the presence of short-term rentals and the impact they have throughout the community. So thank you so much for having me, and I'm super happy to be here with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kafia. I think that national landscape is so important to put in context the opportunity and understanding we're not alone. British Columbia as a region and a district is seeing all over the world different jurisdictions that are dealing with the same issue. Now I'd like to introduce Professor David Washmuth, really known as the Canadian lead for analyzing with his Division of Urban Politics and Governance. David, I just see you're on mute. I'd like to thank you so much for joining. I know your wisdom and sharing it is going to be really insightful for everyone. So I'll just hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thanks for having me here, Ingrid. I'm looking forward to the talk. What I'm going to do is put up my slides and take you through hopefully a bit of a whirlwind tour, but hopefully not too much of a whirlwind of the current state of short-term rentals in the province, as well as the housing impacts. As Ingrid said, I lead a group at McGill called the Urban Politics and Governance Research Group, where we conduct public interest research into pressing urban governance problems kind of across the country. And for a number of years, one of those problems has been the impact of short-term rentals on our communities. In BC in particular, over the last couple of years, I've done a bunch of kind of digging into the short-term rental situation in the province in the kind of post-COVID world. Prior to that, I had worked with the city of Vancouver on kind of understanding their regulatory enforcement, like how, that once they had put rules into place, how well those rules were working, what could be done to improve them. But today I'm going to be talking about this work that's province-wide, and specifically the summer update that we've just released and was conducted over the summer, which has very kind of very current figures on short-term rentals in general, but kind of more importantly from my perspective, really tries to put some concrete numbers on the table in terms of the impacts on our housing markets in the province and on communities. So just a kind of quick overview of what I'll be covering. I want to just give a little bit of a look at the short-term rental market as of June 2023, and then dig into the housing impacts by looking both at the way that short-term rentals interact with housing availability and the way they interact with housing affordability, with a specific focus on rental housing, which is kind of where we target our research. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit about short-term rental regulatory options. And I'll probably be kind of duplicating to some extent what Kafia is saying, but I'm going to kind of tell this, let's say, tell this story from the perspective of the research that I've done with communities across the country. So, try to be kind of evidence-based in terms of where I think BC could be going. So to begin, short-term rentals in BC. In June 2023, which is when I crunched all the numbers, here's the kind of big picture. The province had about 28,500 short-term rentals, which were active on average each day in BC houses. And so to be clear about this, and maybe in comparison with some of the other reporting you see on the numbers of short-term rentals, when my team analyzes this, we only look at listings which are actually located in people's homes. So, or let's say in housing units, many of which are not actually people's homes because they're operating as short-term rentals instead. But in other words, we're not going to look at B&Bs that are using Airbnb as a platform, or hotels that are using Airbnb as a platform. We're not going to look at a tent in somebody's backyard. We're looking at this actually short-term rentals active in houses. Because that's the way we can make the most direct link to the housing impacts of short-term rentals. Secondly, we only look at the listings which are actually active. Airbnb has tons and tons of listings which somebody posted 3 years ago because they were out of town for a weekend and they've never bothered taking it down. We remove all those so we can really focus on what's going on the platform in reality. And so this number, 28,500, is how many listings in June 2023 were actually available for rent or being rented on every given day. These listings earned $133.8 million in the month of June is our estimate, which is $5,800 per listing. Although, of course, as I'll talk about in a bit, that revenue isn't very evenly distributed among listings. Some listings earn a ton, were earning a lot more than that for the month. Others were earning quite a lot less because they were only being rented occasionally. The biggest points to emphasize at a very high level before we dig into some of the details are, first of all, that 2023 has seen extremely rapid growth in short-term rentals in BC. So on a year-over-year basis compared to June 2022, we're looking at 17.8% growth in listing inventory and active listings, and 17.3% growth in revenue. Sorry, I've repeated listings twice there, but the second number is revenue growth. With the result that BC short-term rental market is now at an all-time high, which is really worth emphasizing because this is a market that suffered quite a lot during the pandemic, as the broader hospitality industry did, and I actually don't believe the short-term rental market has fully recovered from the pandemic, in the sense of I think we should expect a lot more growth going forward unless there's some changes to the rules. I'll talk about that in a bit. But we are now able to say something that we weren't able to say for the last several years, which is that this market is bigger than it has ever been in the past. To kind of break this down by region, in the report that we did, we analyzed the short-term rental market across the different tourism regions in the province, and in fact there were quite different patterns. But what I could kind of emphasize maybe above all is that by far the highest area of growth year over year in terms of the last since June 2022 to 2023 was in the Lower Mainland, in the Vancouver area. This is, I think, is kind of intuitive in the sense that this was the part of the province where travel had been the most depressed, thanks to the pandemic, because you still had maybe Vancouver residents kind of getting out of the city for kind of local tourism, in 2021, 2022. But international travel in particular really hadn't recovered, kind of long distance travel. Now that's come back, and the Vancouver region has been has kind of seen the most boom in short-term rental market as a result, with a 25% year-over-year growth in listing inventory and a 30% year-over-year growth in revenue. This is what what the kind of patterns look like over time. First of all, looking at active short-term rental listings each day. So kind of across the 6 regions, and the y-axes on these graphs are different, so the absolute numbers are quite different for the different regions. What we see are kind of 2 patterns. So on the one, the center of each of these graphs shows the impact of the pandemic, and again in the Vancouver Coast and Mountains area, as well as Vancouver Island and northern BC, those 3 above all, you see a really, really, really strong impact from the pandemic. But you also see a very rapid recovery, and that recovery really only began in kind of early to mid 2022. In other words, there was a kind of a several-year period of really depressed activity in those regions, and now those curves are growing quite rapidly. In the other regions, there's also an impact, but we also see kind of just a higher level of seasonality in general. These are places that get a lot of warm weather visits, and not so much during the wintertime. If we look at the growth rate in active listings over time, the kind of year-over-year growth rate at a given point in time, where the dotted line in the middle is no growth, what we see is, again, a kind of a very consistent and clear turn towards very rapid growth. Particularly in the bottom 3 regions here, Thompson, Okanagan, Vancouver Coast and Mountains, Vancouver Island, we're looking at growth rates approaching 50% year over year as of the summer of 2023. So when I said kind of in general that we're looking at 18% year over year growth rates, that's the kind of the point in time that's been accelerating basically, and so I think you should expect to see these numbers go up and up quite a bit more in the absence of any regulatory changes. A couple more, and then I'll move on to the housing issues. This is a point that I like to hammer home quite a lot, which is these graphs are showing how revenue is distributed among hosts. So on the left-hand side, we've got kind of every decile. The top 10% are in brown, the next 10% are in that kind of lighter brown. And on the right-hand side, we see how much revenue that slice of hosts accounted for. And the big picture here is that across the province, the top 10% of short-term rental hosts earn about half of all the revenue. In other words, when we hear, the idea that, most people on Airbnb are people sharing their own homes and they're only renting their properties out occasionally, that's true actually. But the flip side of that is that those most people aren't actually a major part of the market. Most of the activity on short-term rental platforms is a relatively small number of hosts who are operating their listings full time. They're operating them like businesses, and they're making a lot of money. And that's what this graph shows here. The last version of this, which I think is also quite important to see, is the trend in the number of multi-listings. And multi-listings is our term for listings which are operated by a host who is simultaneously operating other listings. And so we're talking about multiple entire home properties, or a huge kind of portfolio of private rooms. We don't see much of that anymore, but we still track it. And the big picture here is that over the last 4 or 5 years, reasonably consistently across all regions, the percentage of short-term rental listings, which are multi-listings, which are operated by hosts who have a portfolio of listings, not just one, has been rising steadily. And that was true throughout the pandemic, and it continues to be true now. So, for example, in the Kootenay Rockies region, in Vancouver Coast and Mountains, we're talking about a strict majority of all listings active on the platform belong to hosts with a whole portfolio of listings. And again, just to be clear, all these graphs are going up. That there's been a trend. These have been long-term trends which have continued into the present, despite the pandemic, and also to some extent despite kind of regulatory changes, for example, in Vancouver. So just to summarize here and kind of put a couple of key facts on the slide. First of all, no matter how you slice it, the short-term rental market in BC is dominated by commercial operators. And so, as I mentioned, top 10% of hosts earn just about half of all revenue. And actually just the top 1% of hosts earned more than a fifth of all the revenue on the platform. Similarly, multi-listings account for half of active listings and half of total host revenue as of 2023. And that share has been climbing steadily, and we would expect to continue to climb absent some kind of regulatory shock. Second, it's very clear that the COVID pandemic caused a massive decline in short-term rental activity, the same way it affected the rest of the hospitality industry. But as of 2022, growth has been very strong across all regions of the province, and now the short-term rental market is at an all-time high. Okay, so that's what the market looks like. And really the focus of our research with this report and just in general is about the way that short-term rentals affect housing availability and housing affordability. And they have actually kind of basically two sets of effects. First of all, short-term rentals just directly remove housing from the long-term market. So every full-time dedicated short-term rental that's operating out of a housing unit could otherwise be housing a tenant, or potentially an owner-occupier, but usually a tenant. So just by simple kind of Econ 101 supply and demand, when you remove a bunch of supply of something, but you don't change the amount of demand, then you drive up the prices. And that's the first kind of channel through which short-term rentals affect housing costs. The second one is that they increase the economic value of housing. And the reason for this is that the reason why so many short-term rental operators are operating instead of offering long-term rentals is because they make more money. And if you are looking to buy a property either to live in or to operate as a landlord, as a rental, even if you're not interested in operating a short-term rental, you're in competition with other potential purchasers who might be interested in doing that. And the fact that they can make more money from the short-term rental than you could get from a long-term tenant pushes up the cost of acquiring residential properties, which has kind of knock-on effects directly in terms of owner-occupied housing prices, but also effects in terms of rent for tenants, because the landlords of those buildings have to pay higher costs for the property because short-term rentals offer a more lucrative alternative. So in these two channels, this is kind of, let's say, like the theoretical argument for how short-term rentals affect housing. In a sec, I'll show, empirically speaking, what this looks like. So first of all, we've been tracking the number of full-time short-term rentals operating in BC. So these are there's some kind of sophisticated modeling going on here, but the kind of basic underlying idea is we're looking at listings which are a majority of the year and are being reserved with about, kind of roughly like a 50% occupancy rate in the period of time that they're active. And across all 6 tourism regions, we see pretty sharp upward slopes in the number of these full-time short-term rentals coming out of the pandemic. And I think in particular, I think it's particularly sobering to see these patterns in relation to what the pre-pandemic trends were. So in this graph, the kind of the brown line at the top of each of the areas is what the pre-pandemic trend of short-term rental housing loss would have predicted for heading into the present. What we see that is in every 6 of the tourism regions, even though the amount of full-time short-term rentals, like the housing loss that short-term rentals cost, has been increasing rapidly, in all 6 of these regions, we're still well under the curve of what we would have expected to be happening before the pandemic. In Thompson, Okanagan, it's that line is getting close to catching up, but in the other regions, there's still quite a distance to go. What this means is that to the extent that that kind of top brown line represents something like a kind of like equilibrium for how short-term rental housing loss has been growing over time, there is no reason we should expect the growth rate in full-time dedicated short-term rentals to slow down anytime soon. In fact, the opposite. There's reason to suspect that the kind of underlying market dynamics would support an even greater number of dedicated short-term rentals in the future and all the consequent housing loss that implies. So the other thing that we did was we created a quantitative model which tries to understand the relationship between commercial short-term rentals and rents in BC. And so this is a model developed for every medium-sized and large city in BC where the CMHC gathers data on rents. And we kind of controlled for time, and we controlled for community type, kind of higher tourism and lower tourism type communities, bigger and smaller. And when you kind of run all the math, the result is that what we found is that kind of all other things being equal, for every additional dedicated short-term rental that a neighborhood has per 100 rental units in the neighborhood, we should expect the average tenant to have to pay $49 more in rent each month. This is a very large number, to be very clear. And I want to kind of, I've got some tables with a ton of figures on it. I'll just kind of talk through a little bit of it, and these can be, but you can kind of read the report for the fuller story on these to kind of give a feel for how this works. I've highlighted the Vancouver Island region here, just kind of arbitrarily. And first of all, we're looking at the period of time before and into the pandemic. So in the period of time from 2017 to 2019, the monthly rent, the median monthly rent in the Vancouver Island region, changed on $60 over this time period, and what we estimate from our model is that $18 of this can be explained by the growth of short-term rentals, of commercial short-term rentals in that time period. That's kind of the median, so that for the kind of median community, and then in total for the Vancouver Island region, over the year 2017 to 2019, we think that 36%, so more than a third of all the increases in rent which occurred in the Vancouver Island region in those 3 years, can be explained by the presence and the growth of commercial short-term rentals. Similar numbers in the other, in the other regions. It's a lot lower in Vancouver because basically the city is regulating pretty strongly. The regulations are coming on at this time. It's even substantially higher in Thompson, Okanagan, and the Kootenay Rockies. And then in 2020, which is the kind of right-hand side of the table, the situation really changes, right? Because what happens here is that short-term rentals are disappearing during the pandemic. And particularly, my team documented, hundreds and thousands of short-term rentals switching from Airbnb to long-term rental platforms like Craigslist. And we used actual photo recognition to prove this, the same listing moving back and forth. And during this time period, we see the opposite impact, which is to say that in communities that had larger decreases in commercial short-term rentals, they also had lower increases in rent. So, in the 2017 to 2019 period, we document that more short-term rentals means higher rents. And then during the pandemic, we see the opposite relationship. We see that fewer short-term rentals means lower rents. So this is really strong evidence that we've got a real pattern here. We've got short-term rentals growing and rents are growing. We've got short-term rentals declining and rents are declining proportionally. And then to kind of finish that off, we've got the same kind of figures for 2021 and 2022. And again, kind of looking at Vancouver. In Vancouver Island, 2021, the short-term rental market continues to be lagging. This is still in the aftermath of the pandemic, and so the short-term rentals are exerting negative pressure actually on rents because they're on balance, they're leaving the market, adding more housing as opposed to kind of entering the market and reducing housing. But as of 2022, that pattern has shifted back to one of growth of short-term rentals and impacts on rent. And so just about 20% of the increase in rent, which happened in Vancouver Island in 2022, can be explained by the fact that short-term rentals are back to growth, and the same kind of numbers we can see across the whole province. So to wrap up, in 2022, what we found is that the average BC neighborhood in a medium and large city saw a $20 greater increase in monthly rent than would have been expected if dedicated short-term rentals had not returned to growth in 2022. And this is, this is actually like I think, frankly, a gigantic number, because most households don't leave their apartment. Most households don't see gigantic rent increases. So this is $20 in monthly rent on average for every household. Right? Many of those households, the ones who are moving to find a new apartment, will be facing much, much, much higher increases in rent because of short-term rentals. What we also expect, if we look at current trends, is that if the province's short-term rental market remains on its current trajectory, we think that the housing loss caused by short-term rentals is going to increase at least another 15%. We're going to be looking at close to 20,000 full-time short-term rentals taking housing off the market, which would be expected to imply another further $23 a month in average monthly rents, which BC renter households are going to be forced to pay as a result. So that's the situation. And now, just very quickly, I want to run through a couple of what my team and I have identified through our research as really promising options for regulating the short-term rental market, and then kind of talk about what I think the implications are for the province of BC. So I just want to, basically, I'm going to kind of pass along some lessons from some of the work we've done in different jurisdictions across the country, starting with Vancouver. And the lesson from Vancouver is that principal residence restrictions work. So in my personal opinion, I think home sharing style short-term rentals are perfectly fine. If you're away for the weekend and someone stays in your apartment while you're gone, I think that is a win-win. You earn a little bit of extra money, and the community gets some visitors, and there are no serious harms on the housing market. Commercial short-term rentals don't work that way. They benefit the owner, but it's very clear that the social cost exceeds the benefit that the owner gets. Communities pay too much in additional rent. There's too much additional nuisance, and that in general, jurisdictions should be eliminating commercial short-term rentals and restricting short-term rentals to principal residences. When my team looked at this with the city of Vancouver, we found very clear evidence that even though their rules on imposing a principal residence restriction maybe weren't being fully enforced as well as they would like, they very clearly got housing back onto the long-term market. And here are just two graphs that I think really make this case. So these are graphs comparing Vancouver with Montreal and Toronto. The dark green line is Vancouver, and then the other ones are Montreal and Toronto. On the left, we've got active listings. In the middle, we've got frequently rented entire home listings, which are basically the full-time operations. And on the right, we've got multi-listings. And what we see is that Vancouver was behaving very similarly to Toronto and Montreal prior to the rollout of its principal residence restriction. But once that occurred, the other two cities sharply diverged. In particular, the middle graph here. While the number of frequently rented entire home listings in Vancouver did increase a little bit over the time period, it skyrocketed in the other two peer cities. So in other words, without these regulations, we would expect Vancouver to be behaving like Toronto and Montreal, since it was behaving like Toronto and Montreal before the regulations. What we found instead is that the growth of full-time commercial Airbnbs in Vancouver really stagnated after the rules went into effect. Now, ideally, they would have vanished, and that didn't quite happen, but they stagnated, and that means hundreds of houses back on the long-term market. And I think the pattern is even more stark when we compare Vancouver with the rest of Metro Van, with the rest of the Lower Mainland. So now the green line is the city of Vancouver, and the red line is the rest of the Vancouver region. And again, if we look at the frequently rented entire home listings, we see just a dramatic divergence, where the full-time Airbnbs are stagnating after Vancouver's regulations come into effect, and they're skyrocketing in the rest of the region. In other words, there's still tons of demand for commercial short-term rentals in the Vancouver region. But because Vancouver, the city, has restricted them, that demand is headed to Richmond, it's headed to Surrey, and the rest of it. And the implications of this, by the way, I'll come back to at the end about whether it should be the cities or the province who's setting these kinds of rules. Second lesson is from Toronto, which is to beware of length of stay loopholes. Toronto's rules, like Vancouver's rules, like a lot of places' rules, define short-term rentals with a maximum of 28 days or something, kind of something in that ballpark. What happened in Toronto when Toronto established a principal residence requirement several years after Vancouver is that Airbnb kind of gamed the system by shifting over a ton of listings which weren't getting registered and which in theory they were supposed to remove from the platform, shifted them to 28-day minimums instead. And so this is the graph. I don't know how comprehensible this will be, but the idea is that the blue lines are November, before these regulations came online, and almost all the actions on the left-hand side, these are minimum stays of 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, up to 7 days, that kind of thing. After in February, when we looked at this, after Toronto implemented its rules, most listings on Airbnb were had 28-day minimums. The problem here is that in reality, if you send the host a message, they'll let you book the place for the weekend on the side, but the city isn't going to be able to regulate this properly. They don't have any information about the host because they haven't registered in the system. And it basically creates an enormous incentive for deception and for kind of getting around the registration system instead of actually being regulated by it. So, in general, we think that having defining short-term rentals with some kind of minimum number of days of stay is a mistake, because it leads to this huge loophole. Finally, the lesson from Quebec, where I live and work, is to prioritize platform accountability. Quebec, since 2020, has had, in theory, very good provincial rules about short-term rentals. Every short-term rental host in the province has had to register with the province, and then municipalities, in theory, get access to that information and they can use it for enforcement. But until very recently, these rules were not worth much more than the paper they were written on. And that's because Airbnb refused to play a part in enforcing them. Airbnb easily could have removed any listing that didn't have a registration number, but they chose not to. And the situation only finally changed after the tragic fire in Montreal in March, when 7 people died, I think 6 of whom in an illegal Airbnb. And as of the last couple of weeks, the current version of Quebec's provincial law holds Airbnb accountable to the tune of $100,000 per listing, for each listing that does not have a proper permit operating on its platform. So that's enough money that's basically saying you either follow the rules or you get out. And it's too bad that it took Quebec so long to get to this point where they insisted on platform accountability, and that people died along the way. But this is definitely a situation where the Quebec experience demonstrates how vital platform accountability is to making workable rules. Without that platform accountability piece, without Airbnb being required to play its part, you're not going to get anything done. So finally, a plan for BC. I'm going to echo a lot of what Kathy has mentioned, but for me, the kind of key points are that the province should establish a single mandatory short-term rental registration system for all of BC. I think it should regulate platforms instead of booking duration, so it shouldn't make a difference between 28 days and 27 days. But the lawyers have to sort that kind of thing out. But the key idea is that they should share that information with cities, but not require every city to make its own version of these rules, which is just useless duplication. And then secondly, and most importantly, municipalities, or ideally the province, should establish principal residence requirements which redirect short-term rental markets towards home sharing and away from commercial operations. And they should make Airbnb and other platforms partners, require them to be partners in enforcing these rules. So with that, I want to say thank you for your time. I look forward to any questions anybody has.
Thank you so much, David. Yeah, thank you very much. Incredible research. Kelsey, I think we have a couple of more slides, and I see we've got only 8 minutes or something left. So what's next for BC? We have 4 key recommendations. As David indicated, principal residence only. This is critically important and is proven in different jurisdictions. I know Kafia referred to it, as did David, and certainly the research all around the world and within jurisdictions across Canada shows that this has the greatest amount of impact to ensure that there is available, affordable rental housing, and really restricting them to principal residence is key. Also, making sure that principal residents are not commercialized. So again, that goes back to the whole financial piece of the housing market. Advocate for provincial short-term rental registry. So this is critical. This really means that we're emphasizing BC's opportunity to set a Canadian precedent, and we're looking at other jurisdictions like Quebec, and really the success of Quebec's compliance issues that is addressed through Bill 25. The provincial registry is critical to make sure that those platforms can be accountable. So we're asking for a provincial registry with platform accountability. This means business licenses, and it means that advertising provincially registered properties only, and that there is a display of valid registration on every listing. This really ensures that compliance, and that provides then the next opportunity, which is for the municipalities to receive real-time data sharing. Municipalities all have community master plans. They have goals of livability and affordability. So if we have principal residents and we have alignment with community plans and they have real-time data sharing, it really enables them to ensure that they're able to manage this part of the housing that is aligned with the livability in their communities. Understanding the constraints. This is really important for us to understand. Large cities and municipalities have significantly more capacity to deal with this than smaller jurisdictions in rural areas. We are not against short-term rentals at all. There are many jurisdictions around the province that we can look at. We need seasonal, or we need housing for short-term rentals for projects in forestry or pipelines, etc. And rural versus urban is also very different. So the need to make sure that we're supporting communities and the appropriate policy within municipalities or regional districts is really what we're ensuring that we're enabling here. So what we can do, we can engage our communities. We can familiarize ourselves with the regulatory toolkit that we've put together, and this is available on our website for you. Contact your municipality and be engaged in ensuring that you're understanding the impact and also advocating for our 4 short-term rental recommendations. You know, community members and businesses of all ilks in all regions in the province really need to make sure that if we're going to be successful in business, our employees need somewhere to live and they need affordable housing. And that really is the driver here. I know that we have really a short period of time. I know Kelsey will put the link in the chat or the Q&A to the toolkit for municipalities. And the next piece of work we now need to do is to support municipalities and regional districts and regions as a whole to make sure that we're supporting them, A, with the research, and B, with the recommendations to enable them to make the appropriate bylaws and policies. We have a couple of minutes for some questions here. So I'm going to go through here. Is there any research on why the supply of short-term rentals has increased so dramatically? Supply responds to demand. So what drives the demand? David, do you want to take that one on?
Sure. So I think that the way I would answer this question is that is kind of thinking about the pre-pandemic and the post-pandemic era. And so pre-pandemic, basically the growth of short-term rentals is a combination of from the demand perspective is people becoming more familiar with this as a travel option, but also the professionalization of the supply. So in other words, that the kind of big transition on Airbnb's platform is from home sharing to professional offerings, which kind of feel more like hotels. And that that was the kind of longer term story that was kind of leading to a certain level off. The pandemic kind of put a big drop in those numbers. And now post-pandemic, we're kind of seeing basically a catch up to that growth. But fundamentally, the professionalization of short-term rentals, I think, is the kind of thing that has helped drive a lot of the demand there.
Yeah, thank you, David. We have a question. Will this model be applied to rural areas where tourism is a primary sector and housing is grossly impacted? Absolutely. So the research, and it is available for you to look at. So wherever you are, rural, remote, urban, we've been able to do a scan of the entire province. And that rural impact is one that David has been able to really quantify. The key here is now we have the research, then we have the toolkit, and I see there are several comments about the responsibilities of municipalities, and you're absolutely right. they need the research in order to make sure that they're developing the appropriate policy that aligns with the livability of their community plan. And without the research and without the real-time data from the short-term rental platforms, they can't possibly do that because it's very elusive. There's lots of different ways of making sure that it's enforced, but they need that platform or the registration for the provincial level. They need the real-time data, and they need the platform to be accountable. Otherwise, that actual real data, it cannot support the appropriate policy development. I'll just look and see, Kathy, I see there was a couple of questions for you around the 3% tax. Thank you for responding there. You know, it takes time to change policy at the municipal level. And, you know, we have about 90 municipalities in British Columbia. So certainly it's going to take some time, but education and real data and, you know, also examples of policy from other jurisdictions will be available to make sure that that is being addressed. And I know this week with UBCM, there's a lot of conversation around housing affordability and availability. And this is only one of the tools and one of the answers to address that in the province of British Columbia.
One of the questions that came through in the Q&A that I think is worth addressing is from UK Yorkie. Says, I've heard a variety of times that majority of hosts wouldn't put their units into the long-term pool as they like having the ability to have the unit available to family and friends when they want it. I've heard maybe 15% of short-term rental units would turn into long-term if forced. Is there any data to support this? I think this is a very important question to address when we're thinking about housing impacts, because the reality is that short-term rental, the existence of short-term rentals has made it much easier for people to hold on to kind of basically like extra housing without actually getting tenants. You know, it used to be that if you wanted to make money off your property and you weren't living there, you had to find a tenant, and that was a big supply of affordable rental housing in the province. Because instead you can choose to effectively hold a property vacant. And you know, in the sense of you have it available for friends and family when you want to, and you can use Airbnb to pay the bills. It's made it much easier for people who have the money to hold on to second properties and take them out of the housing stock. So I think there is absolutely no evidence, or let me say that I think everything we know about how housing works is that if you were not allowed to operate commercial short-term rentals, there would be a massive shift of these properties back to the long-term rental market, because all the people who prefer having the flexibility of not having a long-term tenant just wouldn't have the option to do otherwise. They'd either have to find a tenant or sell to somebody who would. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic when there wasn't a lot of demand for short-term rentals. And I'm sure it's exactly what would happen with stricter rules. So I don't think this is a serious concern.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just so that you know, this research has been shared with our provincial government, with UBCM. UBCM is completely aligned and supports the recommendations and outcomes. And we also will make this available. I know we have a couple of moments left. Kathy, I don't know whether or not you have sort of some parting comments, and David as well, or whether or not there's one of the questions that you'd like to answer. I do think we have a couple of minutes left.
There was a lot of comments on municipalities and sort of the hurdles to transfer short-term rentals to the long-term rental market. And so I think what's really important is to engage with your city council. There's most likely a member there that's passionate about housing, knowledgeable about the issues, and bringing international best practices. I had referenced Florence for tax incentives for owners to revert their short-term rental units into the long-term rental. So just regulations that ease that process to alleviate the housing crisis. I think that's a great place to start to build support for change.
And I will say there is one comment about regional districts and business licenses. You know, it is our position that commercial operators have to have a business license, and it is a 1-year license, so that inventory can then go back into the long-term rental market, or for them to be a one owner principal resident share short-term rental. And that is part of our advocacy with our provincial government, and we will continue to make sure that we're working hand in hand to ensure that that commercialization and the pressure on the housing affordability is reduced. And that really is around our commitment and dedication to the workforce and the people that are employed within all industries. This is not just our industry, it's impacting all businesses in all jurisdictions of the province. And I just want to acknowledge, David, you and your research team, we can't advocate without research and the real-time data that you've been able to provide for us to see the kind of growth, both from a revenue perspective, but from that commercialization is really the greatest impact on affordability in the province right now. So my hope is when we find the employees to work within our businesses, that we can also at the same time ensure that they have somewhere to live that is affordable and that they can make that new position or job or community their home. And currently that is a very, very difficult thing to do in British Columbia and in fact across Canada. So I think this is one of the answers that will alleviate the pressure on not only rental housing prices, but also house prices and provide solutions for our workforce strategy. David, lasting parting comments for you?
Well, I would just say that, it's always a great pleasure of mine to be able to connect the research that we do with actual kind of policymaking and advocacy. And, I got into this topic because I'm concerned about housing affordability, and, it's great to have allies in that fight.
Thank you very much, David. Kafia, David, I know we're out of time. We couldn't do this without you. Thank you so much. And it will be made available for all of you. So thank you. Do take the best of care.
Thanks a lot.